Half the people you know gone in 18 months. Not in a war, not in a famine you could see coming across a season of failed harvests. From something silent, something no one could see, something that arrived on an ordinary spring wind and did not stop until one in every 2 faces you knew had simply vanished from the world. That is not a legend, and it is not an exaggeration. Between 1348 and 1350, that is very close to what actually happened across England and much of Europe. And here is the part that almost no one ever tells you. For the poorest people who survived it, for the ordinary peasants who somehow lived through those 18 months, the plague would turn out to be, in the long and terrible run, the best thing that ever happened to their families. Hold on to that, because it will not make sense for a while. First, you have to live through the thing itself, so let me put you inside it. The year is 1348. You are not a king, and you are not a bishop. You are an ordinary person, a villager somewhere in the English countryside, in a small huddle of thatched cottages around a stone church, fields stretching out beyond the last house, mud in the lane, wood smoke in the air, the same few dozen faces you have known your whole life. Your world is small and slow. News travels at the speed of a walking man or a plodding cart, and for weeks now the news coming up the roads from the south has been getting worse. A sickness has crossed the sea. It came ashore, they say, at a port on the coast, carried in on a ship, and it is moving inland now, town by town, village by village, coming north the way weather comes, and there is nothing between it and you but a few more days of road. You do not know what it is. You have no idea that it is a bacterium, a living thing far too small to imagine, riding in the blood of rats and in the bite of their fleas, and perhaps, in the worst cases, passing straight from breath to breath between people crowded together in cold rooms. All of that is knowledge that lies 6 centuries in your future. All you know is that it is coming and that it kills. Then, one week, it arrives, and I want you to feel what that week is actually like, because this is the heart of it. It does not come as an army or a storm. It comes as a single person feeling unwell. A neighbour, a man you have known since childhood, complains of a headache and a deep, bone-tired ache in his limbs, and a chill he cannot shake even by the fire. Within a day he is burning with fever, and then his family sees the thing everyone has been whispering about, the sign that turns fear into terror. In the soft places of his body, at the neck, under the arms, in the groin, hard swellings rise up under the skin, some as small as an egg, some the size of an apple, dark and hot and agonizing to touch. These are the buboes that give the bubonic plague its name. Dark blotches spread across his skin like bruises blooming from the inside, and then, very often, in 3 or 4 days, sometimes less, he is dead, and it does not stop with him. It moves through his house like a hand passing over a row of candles, his wife, his children, the neighbour who came to help. Within a week, a whole family that was alive and ordinary can be gone, their cottage silent, the door hanging open, and no one willing to go inside. Now multiply that by every house in the lane. This is the part the numbers alone can never quite carry. The church bell, which has rung all your life for weddings and for Sundays, now rings and rings for the dead, until at last, in many places, they stopped ringing it at all, because the endless tolling was breaking people's hearts, and there were not enough of the living left to bury the dead. In the Italian city of Siena, a man named Agnolo di Tura lived through exactly this, and he wrote it down in words that reach straight across 700 years and take you by the throat. He described a horror so great that no one wept for the dead, because everyone expected death themselves. And then he wrote a single line that tells you everything. He buried his 5 children with his own hands. Read that again slowly. A father digging graves for his own 5 children, one after another, alone. That is not a statistic. That is one ordinary man in one ordinary town, and there were countless others like him in every corner of the dying continent. So what do? You, the villager, standing in your doorway, watching this come up the lane toward your own family? What can you possibly do to live? This is where it gets fascinating, because the people of 1348 were not stupid. They were desperate, and they were searching, and they tried everything they could think of. Almost all of it was useless, and some of it made things far worse. But hidden in among all the failures, a few people, through hard experience and simple luck, stumbled onto ideas that actually worked, ideas so sound that we were still using versions of them in the year 2020. There was even a phrase for the best of that advice, 3 Latin words that a wise physician of the age would give you. Cito, longe, tarde, flee quickly, go far, come back late, leave fast before the sickness reaches you. Put real distance between yourself and the crowded, dying places. And whatever you do, do not hurry home the moment things seem calmer. Wait far longer than feels necessary. That single scrap of advice, Cito, longe, tarde, was worth more than every doctor, every prayer, and every charm in the country, and we will come back to why it worked so well. But first, look honestly at everything that did not work, because the failures tell you just as much about what it was like to be alive and frightened in this year. The learned men of the day, the greatest medical minds in Europe, were asked what was causing all this death. In 1348, the King of France put the question to the medical faculty of the University of Paris, the finest doctors of the age, and they delivered their answer with total confidence. The cause, they explained, was a corruption of the air itself. A bad air, a poisonous mist they called miasma, brewed up by a sinister alignment of the planets Saturn, Jupiter and Mars, and rising from swamps and rotting matter and unburied filth. Disease, they were certain, was something you breathed in from foul, stinking air. Now, this was completely wrong about the true cause. But hold on, because buried inside that wrong idea was a strange, accidental spark of something right, and it would end up saving lives for the wrong reasons entirely. If bad air killed you, then the answer was to avoid bad air. So people carried sweet-smelling things everywhere they went, bunches of flowers and herbs, and little balls of scented wax and spices called pomanders, held up to the nose to keep the deadly stink away. They filled their homes with the smoke of burning herbs. It did almost nothing against the plague itself, but a family clutching flowers to their faces and shutting their door against the reeking street was, without ever understanding why, sometimes keeping itself away from crowds and sick neighbours, and that, not the perfume, is what occasionally spared them. Other remedies had no accidental benefit at all. Doctors would open a vein and bleed a patient, draining away the very strength they needed to fight. They lanced the buboes and pressed strange poultices against them, mixtures of herbs, of tree resin even, in some grim recipes, a plucked live chicken or a flattened frog laid against the swelling to draw the poison out. People swallowed powdered gems and flakes of gold. They wore amulets and charms, scratched with holy words and lucky signs, hung around the neck to ward the evil off. None of it touched the disease, and some responses did not merely fail, they actively fed the fire. In their terror, convinced this was the wrath of God, whole processions of people known as flagellants moved from town to town, stripped to the waist, whipping their own backs bloody with knotted iron-tipped cords to beg forgiveness for the sins of the world. Imagine the intention, and then imagine the reality. Crowds of bleeding, exhausted strangers, travelling in a tight group from one infected town straight into the next, gathering huge audiences of the frightened in every marketplace. They were, without knowing it, a moving engine for spreading the very death they were trying to stop. And in the cruellest mistake of all, in many towns people decided the cats and the dogs were carrying the sickness, and killed them in great numbers, wiping out exactly the animals that might have kept down the rats whose fleas were among the real carriers. Fear, again and again, reached for the wrong answer, and here I need to stop you, because there is one image that has probably been sitting in your mind this whole time, and it does not belong in this village at all. That famous plague doctor, the sinister figure in the long black coat and the mask with the long curved beak, like some terrible human crow. If you are picturing him stalking these English lanes in 1348, gently let him go. That beaked mask was not invented until the 1600s, roughly 300 years after this outbreak, dreamed up by a French physician who packed the hollow beak with herbs to filter that same imaginary bad air. The people dying in front of you in 1348 never saw one. Their doctors were ordinary scholarly men in plain gowns, holding herbs to their own noses, mostly helpless and mostly in the end keeping their distance like everyone else. Which brings us to the thing this whole story has been circling, because everything the learned men told you to do, the bleeding, the gold, the planets, the poultices, was wrong, completely wrong. And yet 3 simple things actually worked, and they worked so well that they are the very same things people reached for again, almost by instinct, when a new plague swept the world in living memory. The first was distance. Not perfume, not prayer, but plain physical distance from other human beings, and above all from the sick. The sickness spread through people, through the fleas they carried and the crowds they pressed into, and, in its deadliest form, through the very breath of the dying. So the further apart people stayed, the safer they were, whether they understood the reason or not. The second was isolation. In places where the healthy shut the sick away, or where a whole household simply barred its door and refused all visitors, waiting the horror out in silence, the chain of infection could be broken. There is a famous story from a later English outbreak of an entire village that took this to its heroic limit, choosing to seal itself off completely, forbidding anyone to leave and carry the death onward to their neighbours, and paying for that choice with their own lives to save the villages around them. The principle underneath it is the one that matters. Cut the sick off from the well, and the fire has nothing left to burn. And the third was flight. The single best thing an ordinary person could do, if they possibly could, was to leave, to get out of the crowded, filthy, teeming town, where people lived packed close together in the perfect conditions for the plague to leap from body to body, and to scatter into the thin, empty, open country. This is exactly what the wealthy did when they could. In Boccaccio's great work The Decameron, written in these very years, a group of young Florentines does precisely that, fleeing the horror of the plague-choked city to wait it out in a country villa in the hills, passing the long, frightened days by telling one another stories. Flee quickly, go far, come back late. And now, slowly, the world began to turn that hard-won instinct into law. In the port cities, where every arriving ship might be carrying death in its hold, officials started to act on a simple, radical idea. When a ship arrived from a place where the plague was raging, they would not let its people and cargo come ashore, not at once. They would make the ship wait, held apart, offshore or on an isolated island, for a fixed span of time, long enough for the sickness to show itself among those on board if it was there. In 1377, the city of Ragusa, on the Adriatic coast, the city we now call Dubrovnik, passed the very first law of its kind in recorded history. Newcomers from plague lands had to wait in isolation before they could enter. At first, the waiting time was set at 30 days. Later it was lengthened to 40, and the Italian word for 40, quaranta, gave that 40-day wait its name, quarantine. Every single time you have heard that word in your own life, you have been speaking a piece of the 14th century, an idea forged in fire by desperate people who had learned, at a cost we can barely imagine, that keeping the newly arrived apart from everyone else could hold back the dark. And if all of this is beginning to sound strangely familiar, that is not an accident, because you have watched a version of it yourself. Not long ago, in a year every one of us remembers, a new sickness moved across the whole earth, and think about what people were told to do. Keep your distance from one another. Shut yourself away when you or someone near you fell ill. Wait out the danger behind a closed door. And when they could, people fled the dense, crowded cities for quieter, emptier places. Distance, isolation, flight. The same three instincts reached for by frightened human beings 700 years apart, arriving in the end at exactly the same answers a terrified English villager stumbled toward in 1348. We had far better tools to understand why it worked. We did not have a single better idea about what to actually do. And now, at last, we come back to the promise I made you at the very beginning, the strangest turn in this whole grim story, because the plague finally burnt itself out. After those 18 months of horror, the deaths slowed, and then, mostly, they stopped, and the survivors lifted their heads and looked around at a world that had been utterly transformed. Somewhere between a third and a half of everyone was simply gone. Historians who have studied it most closely, scholars like Ole Benedicto, estimate that the Black Death killed perhaps 50 to 60% of the entire population of Europe. And now imagine you are one of the peasants who lived. You wake into a half-empty land, whole villages stand silent. Fields your family worked for generations lie open and unploughed, because the hands that worked them are dead. And here is the thing that changes everything. For your whole life, and your parents' lives before them, there had always been too many people and not enough land. You were bound to your lord's manor, made to labour for almost nothing, because you could always be replaced by the line of hungry people behind you. That was the logic of the old world, and it had held for centuries. But now, suddenly, brutally, that logic was shattered. Now there were far too few workers, and the crops still had to be brought in, and the animals still had to be tended. For the first time in living memory, ordinary working hands were scarce, and anything scarce becomes valuable. So the survivors, quietly at first, began to understand their new power. If one lord would not pay a fair wage, another one, desperate for hands, would. Peasants began to demand more, better pay, better terms, the right to leave a manor and sell their labour to whoever offered the most. The lords were horrified, and they fought back hard. In England they passed stern laws trying to freeze wages at the old levels, trying to chain everyone back to the way things had been. But you cannot legislate away a shortage of human beings. The pressure kept building, year after year, until in 1381 it burst open, and the peasants of England rose in open revolt and marched on London itself to demand their freedom. That rising was crushed, but the old order never truly recovered its grip. Slowly, unevenly, over the generations that followed, the ancient bonds of serfdom that had held the poorest people in place for so long began to loosen and rot away, and a world in which a common person could own their labour and sell it and move began to grow up in the ruins of the one the plague had destroyed. So think, one final time, of that ordinary villager in 1348, standing in the doorway of a thatched cottage, watching the sickness come up the muddy lane, clutching a bunch of herbs, whispering a prayer, having no idea that half of everyone would soon be dead. That person could not have known that the flight and the distance and the shut door were the only real answers. They could not have known that the same fear would grip the whole world again 7 centuries on and reach for those same answers, and they certainly could not have known that the survivors of this nightmare would inherit a world in which their hands and their children's hands would finally be worth something. The Black Death took nearly everything. It emptied the villages and silenced the bells and buried the children by their father's own hands. But in tearing the old world apart, it cracked open the door to a new one, and through that door, blinking and grieving and suddenly, strangely free, walked the ordinary people who had somehow, against everything, survived.